The room is thinning out as the day wears on, but we're going to spend the next 45 minutes going into a little bit more detail about some of the questions and issues that were raised today. Introducing myself, I'm Rick Bauer. I am working for the Norwegian Refugee Council as their senior water and sanitation and hygiene advisor. I'm also a member of the UK Water Network, along with a number of the other people in this room. In preparing or being asked by Jonathan to help chair this session, I've been thinking a lot about how NRC as an organization and how myself as a WASH professional look at these issues of urban markets, especially with resilience. And I just want to illustrate with a slight anecdote that I've recently, just last week, was in Gaziantep in Turkey looking at NRC's work inside of Syria from cross-border work and looking at what we're doing in terms of water and sanitation. And I was really surprised to hear from our teams there on the ground about the fact that there is ongoing right now in Aleppo and the surrounding areas, which are being bombed to smithereens as we're speaking right now. There is a thriving private market of desludging. There's a lot of septic tanks in the area. The government utilities are no longer doing it, but there's a lot of still private sector actors who are picking up, emptying out septic tanks. We don't know where they're going with them, but they're being paid by the users there. So when it comes to looking at the resilience of markets, I'm always surprised by the resilience of people in humanitarian crises, but I think this is a good illustration of a resilience of market forces and how we need to pay better attention to how we can support them. This panel, this illustrious panel, consists of Lucy Stevens, Senior Policy Advisor from Practical Action, who we've just heard, Beatrice, who is a Senior Program Officer of some sort with ODI at the WASH, in their WASH program. Eric Batings, who's my Norwegian is a little rusty, excuse me, is a senior sanitation specialist at IRC. We have Sophie, who has just returned from Ghana just a couple of hours ago, who's the director of Tremolay Consulting. Yeah, and we have Jonathan Parkinson from Oxfam. I've got a couple of questions, and then we will, just to throw off, and then we're going to be asking questions of the group and on the online audience. But what I would like to really encourage, and I will be selective, is I want to hear questions from other people in the room. We've been hearing some good questions, but it's the same 5 or 6 people. So I want to be hearing from other people in the room what your questions are. The first question I'd like to start out with is, I was very interested in the previous presentation that Jonathan and Lucy presented, in which Lucy very clearly stated the role of her organization, a more traditional development organization, as being a facilitator role versus a direct market actor. We then had Jonathan talking from a humanitarian perspective, from an activist point of view, as Oxfam is, to be looking more at, I don't think you could call the stuff that we were doing, that Oxfam was doing in the Philippines, as facilitation as much as direct market acting there. So I guess my first question to the group is, what do you think the proper role, or a role, for NGOs on either the development or the humanitarian side, or research institutions or consulting firms, to help support more market-based approaches?
Thanks, Rick. I think what I'm going to do is try to tell you a little bit of more of what I think it means for us in practice, and how I think we may have changed some of what we do recently. And that's not to say that everything that Practical Action does around the world is like this, but I think it's a direction that we're trying step by step to move towards. So perhaps in the past we might have had a project which included budget lines to pay for a certain amount of toilet construction directly. We would have procured the materials, we would have persuaded households, we would have worked with community groups to decide which households were going to benefit from the toilets that we were going to pay to build. I think as a sort of more of a facilitator catalyst, we would do a lot less of that, and rather concentrate on building the capacity of artisans to deliver those based on and raising the demand of households to ask those artisans to come and build them. I guess the other thing we might do a bit less of is sometimes in the past we would have done a bit more of trying to pick winners in terms of enterprises and concentrate a lot of our efforts on one or two individual enterprises that we were going to put a lot of effort into supporting. And you could say fairly enough that, so what have you been doing in Farrowborough? You've been working with some groups of informal pit emptiers. Are you not putting all your efforts into those to build their capacity? And yes, we are building the capacity of vulnerable groups or whatever, but we're trying to do that in a way which kind of leaves the marketplace open to the entry of new actors and welcoming that, rather than sort of just continuing with one or two enterprises that are the ones that we're trying to build up, perhaps at the exclusion or not really opening our eyes to who else is active in the market. So I guess those are just a couple of ways that we are trying to be facilitators rather than direct market actors. I can maybe think of a couple of others, but those are things that come to mind. And it's not always an easy transition for some of our staff who would quite like to be much more hands-on in terms of supporting enterprise development in a very kind of hands-on way, which we still do up to a point, but trying to work with a broader range of market actors together.
And I'm going to try and answer to your question from the perspective of a researcher. So what can be the role of research in supporting market-based approaches? And I see two main contributions that research can make in terms of two main issues that we need to think of when planning and delivering market-based interventions in both humanitarian and development contexts. First of all, and this is something that we've been looking at at ODI quite recently, and it's some research, a research line that is being picked up by other organizations as well, like University of East Anglia, ICRC have recently released a report on that, and its role of interventions and potentially role of markets in protracted crisis. There are contexts a bit different from the ones that Jonathan, for example, was describing before the Philippines, where you have a natural disaster occurring, the emergency intervention coming in, and in a way, at a certain point, thinking about the exit strategy and having the development picking up. In some contexts, like we've recently conducted some research in South Sudan, there the crisis has been ongoing, well, the recent crisis for the past 2 or 3 years doesn't seem to be finishing anytime soon. Humanitarians have been there for 2 years. Development agencies have left, but eventually they would like to come back. How do you engage there, and how do you think of how can you use markets in those contexts to work through and deliver better sanitation services to the people, both the people that live in cities, the people that live in rural areas, as well as the people that live in displaced camps, which are quite a lot in contexts like South Sudan, and they're not likely to go back to their houses anytime soon. I think in those contexts in particular, of course other contexts as well, but those contexts represent a situation that kind of allows collaboration between humanitarian and development organizations and interventions to happen if there is appropriate space for this dialogue to occur in terms of humanitarians learning and using the capacities, skills, expertise of development organizations that will be and are in those contexts. At the same time, development organizations being able to pick up on the expertise of humanitarian organizations being there at the same time in the same context, obviously doing different things, but that's the way it should be, serving different needs in different time frames. But we need both. We just need them to collaborate more together. And if markets can be an entry point for this collaboration to start, great. The other point that I would like to make, and always with reference to our experience in South Sudan, is the need to, yes, work with the private sector, but I think it's very important also to understand who is the private sector, who are we actually working with. And in South Sudan, for example, and similarly to the situation that Rick was describing, Syria and Turkey, there's a very big private sector market in Juba, because there's no sewer network, which means that the city basically relies on on-site sanitation facilities. And a recent survey by Suwaza found that there are 150 exhauster trucks, 94% are provided by the private sector. So, and when I was in Juba a few months ago, I was talking to people there, and they were telling me the private sector is the missing opportunity for international actors. They're not realizing and they're not the potential working with them. And this is all great, but at the same time, it's important to conduct a couple market analyses and market assessments with thorough political economy assessments, understand what is the context you're operating with. The risk is that you support the private sector, and the private sector is not what it should be. And a study by the Humanitarian Policy Group highlighted for the food markets that a lot of the private sector actors that actually were able to remain afloat during the conflict were actually linked to the military and to the government. So by supporting them, you ended up supporting the war economy. So the importance of political economy and institutional assessments, and I think research can play an important role in that sense.
I think the potentially, or no potentially, that basically two challenges that I've experienced myself for NGOs trying to play a facilitating role in the war sector, or any sector, I guess. The first one is that, it's great to be facilitator, capacity builder, whatever, a catalyst, but if you're working in a time-bound project with very clear deliverables, it's difficult to leave the driving up to somebody who hasn't really, in your view, maybe not the same capacity of driving the vehicle as you yourself. So there's the tension, I think. So finding the balance between facilitating and allowing local actors to make mistakes, but knowing that you need to deliver at the end of the 4-year or 3-year project is a problem. Another tension is between that maybe we want to achieve sometimes too much. We want to increase access to and use of toilets, especially for the poor. And at the same time, we want to help supporting or strengthening small entrepreneurs to set up viable businesses or to run viable businesses. And some of the programs I've been supporting in the past couple of years, that was almost impossible, because of the way the programs were designed, meant that, to be able to have as many poor people have access to a toilet, an improved toilet, meant that basically the entrepreneurs had to deliver, produce, and sell goods at a price for which they couldn't really run a profitable business. So there's also tension between some of the objectives maybe we have in the same program.
Good, thank you.
Yes, well, so I'll come at it from the point of view of an economist and financial analyst. So I've worked on sanitation markets in the development context rather than the humanitarian context. But I think what strikes me is that we shouldn't be surprised that markets thrive in humanitarian context, because really what happens is market forces take over. We see ISIS as a thriving economy, relying on drugs, Kalashnikovs trading, oil trading, etc. In Somaliland, there's a very thriving economy. So what collapses in humanitarian circumstances is the ability of a state, of a local government or national government to play its role, and that's probably how we should see it, as the sort of characteristics of what happens in what we in a humanitarian context, and what we need to strengthen in order to move to development. Because in the humanitarian context, you basically give up on the state. So you either have a humanitarian response following a disaster where, the state needs extra support that it's not able to deliver, or in the context of, refugee camps, it's the same. You effectively operate in a context where there was no local government before. If you think of, the Syrian refugees camps in northern Jordan, they sort of set up in a place where the municipalities were not established, and all of a sudden you have one of the biggest towns in Jordan, which is established there and that you need to manage. So I think what we need to think about is markets, but also regulation of markets. And Tim made that point before. What collapses is the ability to regulate this market. So you might have latrine empties, but you don't know where the sludge goes to. So I think we need to think of how do we reinforce governments to be able to play their role of regulation, even in the case where they're really under stress. And that may also require thinking more upstream. So, Jonathan talked about downstream intervention, what happens after the disaster struck, and you want to sort of go back to normal life. But I think we also need to sort of have more interaction between humanitarian and development sort of partners in disaster preparation, and effectively think of, if disaster strikes, what is the best solution? So for refugee camps, for example, experience tells us that, in fact, they're there for the long term often. They're not going to evaporate. They're there for 10, 15 years in some cases. So in those cases, should we try upstream to think about what would be the most effective solution, technical solution? Should, instead of putting in temporary toilets, should we put a structure, a solution that is more likely to last according to the length of time that the camp will be there, that we can expect to be there? So probably what development, people can do to work with humanitarian specialists is to think upstream in terms of economic analysis, if you want, of what would be the most optimal solution. Sanergy, I know, has been, looking into getting into a humanitarian context. I mean, they have this system of sort of emptying toilets, which they're trying now in development context, but could also work in camps and could provide perhaps a more lasting solution than just the temporary toilets. But all that depends on, the payback period. Can you influence your service providers to come in? Can you, once, disaster struck or once a camp has been put in place? So this type of analysis upstream, I think, would probably be interesting to reinforce cooperation between these sets of actors.
Thank you. Thank you. Certainly a lot of truisms that I feel very much aligned to what a lot of the panel have said. And I think, thinking back to the initial question, if we look at the Philippines, the situation in the Philippines is very much, as Beatrice was suggesting, is there was a big natural disaster, which is very, very different from your situation in South Sudan. So it's a lot easier to think about it in terms of these phases. And if you think about that, we got the shock to the system, and then there's the initial emergency phase. But actually in South Sudan, that circle has become so small, it's become part and part, and you can't actually tell one phase from the other. So in the Philippines, we did initially start off as a very sort of, I suppose, hands-on response actor. But as time has progressed, we've progressed with it, and I would say that where we are now is very much acting in a facilitating sort of role. So that's the position where we're aiming to be, and I believe we are in the Philippines. But different situations are different. We do want to be in a position whereby those local actors are thereby in a position to be much more responsive in the emergency situation and not dependent on the likes of Oxfam. So we do want to be supporting those actors to be prepared. And I think something that's interesting here is the actual commercial opportunities for actors, market actors in a crisis. So if we're talking about incentives, because the humanitarian responses are so often dominated by the humanitarian NGO fraternity, that the market isn't allowed entry into what effectively are commercial opportunities. So we need to be essentially reinventing ourselves and becoming much more facilitators and supporting those actors and working. But in relation to Sudan, I would, Jenny, my colleague, has just been doing some market mapping and analysis in South Sudan. So it would be, if I may suggest, that Jenny could possibly respond to something in relation to that, because I think she's